Welcome to Go Vote Omaha, presented by the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha. I'm Geri Simon, a League member and your host. Each week we talk about issues that are important for elections. We hope to inspire you to talk to others, your coworkers, your family, your friends about these issues. And most important, when election time comes around, we want to help you be ready and willing to go vote. Today we're going to be talking about redistricting, and we have a guest with us today, John Else, who's the Social Policy Director for the League of Women Voters of Nebraska. Welcome, John.
Thank you. Thank you.
John, tell us a little bit about your background and how you became interested in the League's work.
My background, I started out in community organizing in the civil rights movement in Mississippi, and then came to Omaha, worked in helping to start the anti-poverty program, and then went to the University of Nebraska at Omaha as a professor and taught social policy and community development there. Then went to University of Iowa and did the same thing. And then I took first a sabbatical and then a leave of absence to work in Africa, first in Zambia and then in Zimbabwe, training Africans to take over leadership in that had been held by whites pre-independence. And I got experienced with a number of things were happening there that I thought ought to happen in the United States. So I came back and left the university and started a nonprofit community development corporation in Iowa. We also did research and policy consulting. I left Omaha, was gone about 35 years, and then came back to Omaha in 2010 because our children and grandchildren were here. And it struck me that League of Women Voters is involved in policy issues and both studying them and then trying to influence policy at the state level. And so I volunteered for this position when they were looking for somebody.
Okay, we're very fortunate to have you on that position on the state board. So let's talk particularly about redistricting. We hear this term every decade, I guess, is kind of when it comes up. So what is redistricting?
It is adjusting districts, congressional districts, state legislative districts, and others to fit the population of the state. The population either goes up or down, the total population, and it changes from one part of the state to another. So that there's a need to reorganize the districts. I was interested in Nebraska in 1961. There was over the largest district was more than 5 times the size of the smallest district. It was 18,000 to 100,000. Because there wasn't any requirement for equal size districts. But the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that was part of what democracy is about. And so starting in the mid-60s, states started doing this every 10 years. They hadn't done that before, based on the census each 10 years.
Okay. And the other term that comes up is, it's part of the process of doing redistricting, we hear the term gerrymandering. It always comes up. What is it? What does it mean?
Well, you stimulated my interest in that. I didn't know what it meant, so I looked it up in Wikipedia and found out that in 1812, the Democratic-Republican Party had controlled the legislature in Massachusetts, and they proposed districts, one of which looked really crazy. It went up the west side of Massachusetts and across the northern boundaries. And the Boston Gazette newspaper called it a salamander-like district, and an artist put a head on it and feet on it and so forth. And the editor of the paper said, well, you can call it salamander, but it's really gerrymander. And that name came from the Governor Geri, who opposed it, but gave in to his constituents and signed it. And so it was called gerrymandering, and then it was, that's got picked up and used around the country.
Okay. So it's not a positive term. It's a pejorative, become a pejorative term.
Yes,
and is it
is.
still happening today?
Oh, constantly. My wife and I lived in Florida for a couple of years after we both retired. And one of the districts in our area was a black-focused district with a woman represented the Senate, I think it was, in the legislature. And it went from St. Petersburg, Florida, which is in one county, across the southern part of Tampa, which was in another county, across Tampa Bay, down to Bradenton, and picked up part of the population in Bradenton. So 3 counties, and they called it contiguous because the lake was bordering both places. And one of the things that does is one of the things that gerrymandering does. It put almost an entirely black population in that district, which more or less guaranteed a black representative, but it also took the blacks out of all the other districts that they might have been in and had an influence in with other representatives. And that's part of what gerrymandering does. It focuses, it puts an over-concentration of one party in one district to take them out of other districts. And then what happens is what's happened in our National Congress, that people are not pushed toward the center by the people that they represent. Normally, if you have a wide spectrum of voters in your district, you're going to start coming toward the center, but compromise is out now because the people in districts are so homogeneous that compromise is negative rather than positive.
Okay. Nebraska's had changes in the numbers of its district, and how many do we have right now?
Well, we have 3 congressional districts, and I think that's been, I'm not sure how long that's been true. There's been talk of losing one at some point, but that's not a danger, I think, immediately. I think the number of state legislators has remained 49 for a long time.
Okay. And for Nebraska, then, when you get to redistricting, who draws the lines in Nebraska for the districts?
Well, that has varied over time. The current status is that 6 legislators are chosen to do that. And they're chosen by congressional districts. Because this is a unicameral legislature, we don't have a Republican caucus and a Democratic caucus. We have caucuses of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd congressional districts. And so each of those districts would pick 2 legislators to sit on this committee that would make the decisions about the boundaries and draw the maps.
Okay. And why did the League decide to study redistricting?
Well, it's become a national issue, very important nationally. There's been increasing conversation about how this, the extremism in the National Congress has been based on these kinds of creating districts. And there's been an overrepresentation of one party compared to the total vote of that party in the Congress. And it's primarily because of legislative districts that have been drawn in such a way as to create that. So it's been a major issue for the population generally.
Okay. And as I understand, before we undertook the study, there was an exploratory committee, and they had some observations about redistricting. Could you explain a little bit about what they saw that led them to really recommend doing the study?
Well, Bev Traub, who is a longtime League of Women Voters member, suggested in 1913 annual meeting that there be a study, and a committee was formed to do that, and over the course of that year, it looked at what the possibilities were and whether the league was the appropriate agency to do it. And they decided that it clearly was, that the league is a statewide, nonpartisan organization that does studies before it takes positions. And it was important that there had been discontent after the 2011 redistricting. One city in western Nebraska was split in half, and that was contrary to the policies. And in the second congressional district, which includes Omaha, which is Omaha, there'd been a change in the boundaries that changed the outcome of a couple elections. So there was discontent, and they thought it was important to do. It was very important to good government to have a good redistricting basis, so they decided to recommend doing it if the league could find the resources to do it.
Okay, and the league had never done anything with redistricting before. That's
No.
the reason for the study.
No.
Okay. And so the study started in 2014, is that right?
Yes.
And then what did our study, what did they do? Did we do in that study year?
Well, we had a committee. They had a committee the year before that decided that we should do it, recommended that we should do it. Then they had the new committee to actually conduct the study. We looked at various states that had redistricting and selected out of that process 4 states that had a variety of redistricting and about whom there had been a lot of publicity. Those states are, well, the first state that has the longest term policy is Iowa, our neighbor state. It passed a law in 1980, I think it was. The legislature passed the law, and it's the only one of the 4 that we found where it was a legislative action. The other ones were all popular votes that created that. They passed this law that would create, well, that gave the responsibility for drawing maps to the nonpartisan legislative research agency, which is subject to the, is a body that serves the legislature in writing bills and doing research and that kind of thing. And then they had a commission that they created, was I think 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and an independent that's chosen by those 4 people. But there's a lot of misrepresentation of the Iowa situation because the commission doesn't draw the map. The Legislative Service Bureau draws it without any reference to the to the commission. The commission's responsibility is to hold review hearings statewide and then write a report on that and give it to the legislature. So the Legislative Service Bureau gives their map to the legislature, and they may change it after these hearings, but they then give them a final one. The legislature can vote for it or against it without any amendments. If they vote against it, the Legislative Service Bureau draws a second map, taking into consideration and account the comments that are made during the discussion in the legislature. They submit a second one. If the second one has to be voted on either yes or no with no amendments, it goes back, and if they vote no, it goes back and they do a third one, and it comes back, and in that case, the legislature can make amendments. But if they can't make a decision there, then it goes to the state Supreme Court, who takes the responsibility and draws the lines.
So there's a check and balance on that particular system, trying to keep the politics out of it.
Yes.
Okay. All right, so that's one strategy.
That's one.
So then you have 3 other states you were looking at their strategies.
Arizona did theirs in 2000, and so they've done it twice. Oh, I should say about Iowa, it's has been accepted all 3 times that it's happened, it's done. And once on the first time twice on the first time, once on the second time, once on the third. Arizona has a commission that takes entire responsibility for drawing the lines. And it has 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and an independent third party chosen by those 4. In 2001, it did it and was fairly successful. There were some legal cases, but generally it went fairly well. In 2011, some of the legislators were not happy with what happened, and the governor was upset with the chair, and so he fired the chair, and the legislature, 2/3 vote, supported him. That went to the Supreme Court of the state, which overturned the governor, said he couldn't fire her unless she'd done certain things, and she hadn't done any of those things. So that stood, and it's been, more suits have been filed, but they've all been settled. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld it.
Okay,
So
U.S. Supreme Court.
U.S.
Right.
Supreme
Okay.
Court, yes. So
Okay.
that's Arizona's.
All right.
California, well, I should say Arizona's went by ballot, by a vote. I think they had a 56% vote or something like that. California had a 56 to 60% vote on a ballot measure, and they've done it just once now. But it's a 14-member commission, 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and 4 independents. And those people are identified by the Bureau of State Audit. And they had 300,000 applications, and they picked from those 50 people, 20 Republicans, 20 Democrats, and 10 independents. And then the only role the legislature has is the Democrat and Republican leaders in the House and the Senate each can knock 2 people off of the list, so, of their party. So you could get down to 16, 16, and 10. Then
It's like selecting a jury, isn't it?
yes. Well, actually, the interesting thing is it's the committee that selects appellate judges that does the review process and picks those people. So,
interesting.
and there've been some lawsuits on that, but everybody seems to be happy with it.
Okay. Then we get down to the one that's kind of had cantankerous.
Florida.
Yeah.
And my wife and I lived in Florida for a couple of years after we retired, before we moved back to Omaha. And we're involved simply as legal and voter people contributing to it. And we've been involved, gotten all the emails about it. But that was a constitutional amendment voted by the people, by 63% of the people, that let the legislature keep it. But it provided rules and standards and criteria for the legislature to follow. The Republicans, who were in control at that point in the legislature, and I should say this is a problem whether it's Republican or Democratic control. Whoever it is tries to rig the redistricting to favor them. But in this case, the Republicans were in the control. They put an alternative amendment on the ballot during the ballot process, and the league and the other people had to go to court and get that thrown off the ballot because it was an attempt to confuse the issue. It passed. The legislature ignored it. Or I shouldn't say ignored it, they surreptitiously followed it. They have acknowledged since that they violated the Constitution in all their processes. And they're now starting next Monday, on the 22nd of May, they're having their 3rd special session to revise this, because the courts have constantly supported first districts now, in their objection to what they had done.
Okay, so Florida is kind of an example of trying to gerrymander, I guess, but but being thwarted.
Chaos.
Yeah, and chaos. Okay. I know there are some criteria for redistricting, and there are two major barriers that make it, because of Nebraska's uniqueness with unicameral, there are a couple of barriers to redistricting in Nebraska. So could you talk about what those are?
Well, there are several. One, of course, is we have the only unicameral. So we don't have Democrat and Republican, and it's a nonpartisan, so that we have no Democratic and Republican caucuses to choose representatives.
And we don't have a House and a Senate like you do at the national level. Okay.
So anything that is proposed here has to be different from those things, have different mechanisms and processes. Another problem is we have in our Constitution a provision that senators whose term have only served 2 years, our terms are all 4-year terms. Mm-hmm. It's all Senate 4-year terms, half of them elected every 2 years. Those that had served 2 years but still had 2 years left on their terms have to be provided for in the redistricting, which makes no sense if you're going to have an objective way to choose. And like in Iowa, when they redistrict, they don't pay any attention to incumbents. And so they often have 2 incumbents in one district and none in another. And
here it's kind of protecting the incumbency.
Yeah, here this is protecting the incumbents. Okay. And the interesting thing is the bill that's been proposed by Mr. Moranti and Heath Mello, but Moranti drew it up, the first draft, has 2 things. One is that the redistricting process has to protect those incumbents, but in another place in the bill it says the addresses of the incumbents have to be ignored. So it's a contradiction within the bill, and I think that a constitutional amendment is really a prerequisite here, that we have to get that off of the books and do like every other state does that has a redistricting process, and that is that the people who have 2 years left in the term have to run for another 2-year election. Okay. At that point, and that's only once every 10 years that happens.
Right.
So that's one important thing.
So in the league, to summarize, the league studied this and then came up with some recommendations. Right. What has the league recommended as far as redistricting in Nebraska?
It recommended a set of criteria that are present in almost all of all 4 of these states. And it's a long list, but it includes ignoring incumbents, not giving preferences by party or incumbency, or any other specific thing. As contiguous districts, as compact as possible, and several other issues.
Okay. I know the National League is also looking at redistricting, and do you know anything about that particular study, or when that's going to, is that begun, or are we?
Actually, they've decided not to do a study.
Ah, okay.
They have a task force that has identified what's happening in all the states, and they have a list of how many states have what kind of system and which ones don't have a system, and 34 of the 50 states don't have any special system other than a law like Nebraska has that leaves it in the legislature's hand, and minimal criteria.
Okay, so in those particular states, it's the elected officials who are determining the districts in,
Yes.
in the legislature.
Yes.
Okay, that kind of leaves it open for some gerrymandering, doesn't it?
Kind of like Florida.
Kind of like Florida. Okay.
Except
Anything-
that at least Florida has a constitutional amendment that prohibits it. So whenever they do that, they're violating the
The
Constitution.
Constitution, okay. Well, thank you, John, for being here to talk about redistricting in Nebraska. It's a complex subject, and you've made it a little clearer, I hope, to our viewers. Anything else that you would like to add about redistricting in Nebraska?
Well, a couple of things. One is that the World Herald has had an editorial March 11th that favored the redistricting. It didn't take a position on any of those issues that the World Herald, that the League has taken. And then there was an interesting, more recent guest editorial by somebody Smith, Hendrick Smith, talking about gerrymandering and that that's a major problem for our national Congress.
Okay.
So it's really a very important issue and something that we need to take time to do right.
Okay. I think that that's really one of the goals of the League, to have balanced and fair elections, and this certainly leads to that. So thank you again for being with us.
You're welcome.
Okay. Well, that's all the time we have. For the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha, I'm Geri Simon, reminding you to inform yourself about the issues, talk to others about them, and when election time rolls around, go vote, Omaha.